the Eugene Planning Commission. I don't think we need to do introductions, but we can do land acknowledgement and then follow in on the virtual meeting format statement here in a little bit. Does that sound good? Great. Alyssa, do you want to take us off? Well, Ken, you can email me if you have it.
And I hope he has it because I won't be able to look for it while I'm reading. But here we go. Since the time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards of our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as the Kalapuya Ilahi. Kalapuya descendants are the citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what they do today will affect the many generations who come after them.
Great. So I have one of our older ones, and I think it'll apply for most of everything. For those of you who are joining us, you can access this meeting by watching the live stream on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or you can follow the access instructions on our meeting agenda. You can also do this remotely. Please be aware that your microphone and webcam are muted. If you wish to participate in the public comment portion of the meeting, which is coming up, you can raise your virtual hand now to join the speakers queue. I believe that is next in our queue is the public comment period. Do we have anybody's in our queue for public comment?
So we have one person in our queue for a public comment, and that is Autumn Grattan. And hold on one moment, I will analyst.
Great. So we'll dedicate, we do normally reserve 10 minutes for the beginning of each public meeting for public comment, but as we only have one speaker, we'll reserve 2 minutes for the speaker to give his or her remarks.
Hi, my name is Autumn Grattan, and I'm a student at the University of Oregon. I'm actually here because it's an assignment for my class, as well as I am here to ask for traffic lights on the edges of campus to keep myself and my fellow students safe. As a person who drives and walks in Eugene, there have been times where I felt uncertain. Pedestrians and drivers not knowing whose turn it is during high traffic hours, as well as the constant flow of students that back up traffic at stop signs. The spots I'm thinking of are 13th and Kincaid, 13th and Agate, as well as 15th and Agate. I also think that further down on Agate, 17th and 18th, it would be beneficial to have blinking lights at the crosswalks. So that night it's easier to see pedestrians. Earlier this term, I had a friend get hit by a car and it was because there was low visibility. And I think that we all want to keep everyone safe on and near campus and the traffic that campus brings. So thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you, Autumn. Does staff have a reply they want to direct Autumn correctly on maybe where she can send some notes?
Autumn, I would love to follow up with you somehow and hook you up with the traffic staff who are the traffic engineering folks. If there's a way, where did Autumn go? If there's a way that Autumn, you can reach out to me, I would be happy to get you to the right person.
She's in the attendees.
Okay, I wonder if we
room.
can,
Mhm.
okay, and I probably can't send a message over to them. Shoot.
Well, Lissy, your contact information is in the agenda, correct?
I don't actually, mine is not, but it's on our website. So if you can look on the Eugene Planning website, you will find me there.
And Autumn, if you have any problems or questions, I'll give you my email address. It's fine. It's danpisaacson@gmail.com. If you want to send anything to me, I'll make sure one of us will connect up with you. So thank you for coming to the Planning Commission and offering your thoughts. So next on our agenda is the work session River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Community Advisory Committee nomination approval. Staff, do you have some thoughts here?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner for community planning and design for the city of Eugene. And I'm serving as the interim project manager for the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan since Chelsea Hartman departed for another employment opportunity. This item is requesting the Planning Commission to act in your role approving members of the Community Advisory Committee that guides the process. Over the past 5 years since the project has been underway, there has been a Community Advisory Committee in place to guide the work and check in with the Planning Commission at various points in the process. The next steps for the process are working with the community to bring back a draft plan, and that will be early in the new year when we will bring the project to the Planning Commission as part of the formal adoption process. But tonight is a request for the Planning Commission to approve the recommendation of the River Road Community Organization to appoint Susan Kittleson as an alternate member of the Community Advisory Committee. And that's it. Thank you.
I have Commissioner Fragola.
I'd like to move to approve the nomination of Susan Kittleson as an alternate to the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Community Advisory Committee.
I'll second.
Rich Howard seconds it. There shouldn't be any discussion on this, but if there is any discussion, please free to raise your hand. Commissioner Fragola, is your hand raised for a discussion or?
I'll speak to my motion, sure. Susan Kittleson, I think, is very active in the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood area, and I think she'll be a great addition to the committee.
I will say, full disclosure, I work with her on ARCO board, and she has always been she's been relatively new to the board, but she has hit the ground running and been incredibly active in helping us solidify a lot of the gaping holes that we've had. I was very happy to see that she had put her name forward to be on there. So I think that's great. So we'll call the question. All those in favor of approving Susan as the alternate, signify by raising your hand. All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Moving on to item C, work on the climate-friendly and equitable communities parking reform. Staff has a presentation, I believe.
That's great. I started out muted, so I got that taken care of for everybody. Good evening, Planning Commission. I am Lydia Bishop, the Division Manager of the Building and Permit Services Division, and joining me this evening is Reed Verner. He's the Land Use Supervisor for Building and Permit Services, and we're here to provide you with the details of climate-friendly and equitable community, or CFEC, rules related to parking and electric vehicle charging. Just for context, the reason Reed and I are here talking to you about this evening is because Building and Permit Services has a team under Reed, land use analysts, who actually review building permits and do adjustment reviews for several of the land use rules, including parking. So we're happy to be here discussing this process. Okay, so for tonight, we'll start with a background and give a brief overview. Heather O'Donnell provided that in August, but we'll just give you a quick reminder. And then Reed will delve into some of the details of the parking rules. Some go into effect on January 1st, 2023. And with the we recently applied for a timeline extension to DLCD, which actually allows us to adopt all of the rules by December 1st, 2023. Without that extension, we would have had to have the rules in effect by June of 2023. So that 6-month extension actually provides us an opportunity to do some public involvement, which Reed will discuss at the end of the presentation. So we'll focus our discussion where municipalities have options for implementation. Some of the rules are, you just do this, no discussion. And then there's a place with regards to minimum off-street parking spaces where municipalities have a choice. We're labeling these as option 1, which is to eliminate all parking minimums, or option 2A and 2B. And we'll talk about those in detail shortly. Okay, so before we delve into the discussion, we'll do a quick review of why we're talking about these rules. In 2007, the Oregon legislature adopted a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 75% below the 1990 levels by 2050. According to the state, Oregon is off track in reducing pollution from transportation, which accounts for about 38% of Oregon's climate pollution. On our current path, Oregon will only reduce transportation pollution by about 20% by 2050. And this chart shows the gap between our trajectory, which is the top line, and Oregon's 2050 goal, which is the bottom line. So in response to these challenges, Governor Brown issued an executive order in 2020 directing state agencies to take actions to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impacts of climate change, while at the same time centering the needs of Oregon's most vulnerable communities. The governor also reinforced the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. This chart shows the current trend in the middle bar compared to the 2050 goal, which is on the far right. The subsequent rulemaking process to implement the executive order aimed to significantly strengthen Oregon's administrative rules regarding transportation and housing planning to reduce pollution and increase equitable outcomes. The rulemaking process had an advisory committee. Rob Innerfeld from Transportation Planning sat on that committee, and Heather O'Donnell was added as an alternate a bit later on. The rulemaking process is now complete and has been processed by legal staff, and so the permanent rules were published in August. And before we dive into those, we just wanted to do a brief overview of how our code currently regulates parking requirements. So Eugene codes set minimum parking requirements for all uses and maximums for non-residential uses. We have 3 parking exempt areas, which doesn't require any parking, and those are noted on the slide here. Further, the code allows for reductions of up to 50% for shared parking, and that's where you have 2 uses using a same parking lot in nodal development zones. And also you can apply for an adjustment review to get a 50% parking reduction. Also, middle housing developments are exempt from off-street parking within a 1/4 mile of MX stations. And there are reductions for income qualified units, as well as giving credits for on-street parking spaces. So this diagram gives us an overview of all of the rules we'll be discussing today, and we realize that it's a lot. We've tried to color code them for clarity, and you'll see throughout the presentation that we tried to use the same shades of green as we go through the different parking rules. The first rules which go into effect on the first of the year are called the parking reform rules, and they're applicable within a half a mile of frequent transit corridors. And those are transit lines with 4 or more stops during peak hours. And we'll show some maps a bit later. And there was a choice about how to measure that. And we'll talk about the planning director's direction for that. Electric vehicle rules also go into effect automatically on March 31st. And neither of those had the ability for timeline modification. And then the bulk of our discussion will be on the next set of rules called parking mandates and parking regulation improvements. And as I mentioned, the original date was June 30th, but with our newly approved timeline request, we have an additional 6 months giving us until December 31st. So, and again, you can see this is where we have some options. So option 1 just eliminates parking mandates citywide. We wouldn't require any parking spaces for any new development, and we would allow the developers or sometimes the banks or the lenders have requirements around parking. Options 2, there's a 2A fair parking approach and 2B, a reduced regulation management approach. And if we go with the options, either option 2, there's also an additional set of requirements called parking reforms. And Reed will give us a presentation discussing the details of those. So these are the requirements that become effective on January 1st. The city may not enforce parking mandates within half a mile of the frequent transit corridor. And I have a map in a moment. As I mentioned, there is a choice in the rules about how to measure the half a mile distance from the frequent transit corridor. And it's either by walking distance or by a straight line. And because the rules go into effect by January 1, and we won't be in front of council before then, the planning director has given us guidance to use the measurement by walking distance. It's the most conservative approach, and it also comports most closely to the way that the city council adopted the regulations with regards to middle housing, when there was a choice of how to measure the quarter mile from the MX stops. And then you can see there's some additional uses here that by January 1, we cannot require minimum parking for. So these, I'll show the 2 diagrams that show the impacted tax lots depending on which way the city measures the distance from the, again, frequent transit corridors. So that frequent transit corridor line is shown in blue. And again, that's 4 stops during a peak hour on a transit line. And with a straight line measurement, the gray tax lots are the ones that are impacted. The walking distance measurement here, again, you can see the frequent transit corridor line and the tax slots within a half a mile of the frequent transit corridor are shown in shades of brown. And that is the map that we have received guidance that we will move forward with on January 1st until we're able to get a decision from the city council which one they want to choose. Okay, electric vehicle charging. Oh, sorry, here, got a little mixed up on my notes. So these rules, again, automatically go into effect March 31st, 2023. And the state adopted the goal that 90% of new vehicles be electric vehicles or EVs by 2035. And so to provide some of the infrastructure these vehicles will need, the new rules require some new developments to provide charging capacity for 40% of new multifamily or mixed-use developments. As of July 2022, the building code has a requirement for charging capacity for at least 20% of parking spaces in new multi-unit buildings of 5 or more dwellings and for new commercial uses. So the climate-friendly rules increase that to 40% for the multi-unit buildings with 5 or more dwellings, but the climate-friendly rules don't have requirements for parking. Again, these rules don't have a requirement to be adopted locally, but we do anticipate that they will be part of the code adoption package, so that people, when they look at our land use code, know what regulations apply. And now I'll turn it over to Reed to get into the details of the parking rules.
As a reminder, this is the overview of the CFEC parking rule changes. Lydia discussed the top 2 components, and the next part of this presentation will cover the parking reform options. These are regulations requiring a code amendment that must go into effect by December 31st, 2023. However, before getting into the specific options available, it's worth noting here that there are some parking regulation improvements required regardless of the option chosen. These rules include provisions to encourage the conversion of existing underused parking areas, as well as the requirement to install 50% tree canopy or solar panels and pedestrian facilities for parking areas larger than 1/4 acre in size. Next, let's move on to the options available for reducing parking mandates. Option 1, eliminate parking mandates. This is the most straightforward option provided in the state rules, and it's to remove all parking mandates throughout the city. Staff is already working on draft code that would implement option 1. Removing parking mandates would not do away with parking. It would instead leave it up to developers to choose how much parking to provide based on the market, lending requirements, and other demands. It should be noted that when the city adopts the climate-friendly areas, which is another component of the CFEC rule changes, if the city does not choose this first option and opts for either of the second options, A or B below, staff may need to return to reevaluate parking for compliance with the state rules. If the city chooses to retain parking mandates, we can choose between 2 approaches. However, choosing either option 2A or 2B would require code changes to reform our existing parking requirements. These provisions include pricing a sufficient number of on-street parking spaces, allowing developments to reduce parking mandates for solar panels or EV charging stations, and requiring the parking in multifamily residential developments within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors be unbundled. The unbundling of parking spaces means that parking spaces must be rented, leased, or sold separately from the unit itself. So choosing the second option to reform our parking requirements provides a choice between 2 approaches. Option 2A is the fair parking policy approach. This approach requires cities to adopt at least 3 of these 5 policies. The first 2 policies include requiring unbundled parking for multifamily and commercial developments. The other policies include requiring employers to provide a flexible commute benefit to employees who don't use the provided parking, or a tax on revenue from commercial parking lots, or reducing parking mandates for multifamily developments to no more than 1/2 space per unit. Option 2B is the reduced regulation parking management approach. With this approach, cities are required to adopt all of these changes. There is a lot here, but we have grouped the provisions into 3 areas. The first group is removing parking mandates, starting with mandates near climate-friendly areas and for transit-oriented and mixed-use developments. It also requires removing parking mandates from a variety of specific uses, including group quarters, schools, bars and taverns, studios and 1-bedroom units, for change of use permits, for redeveloping vacant lots, for expansions of less than 30% of building footprint, historic buildings, small businesses, and LEED certified or Oregon residential reach code developments. This option also requires setting additional parking maximums for developments near climate-friendly areas and frequent transit corridors and for other specific uses. Finally, this option requires designating a parking district where on-street parking is managed through permits, payments, or time limits. With the complexity of the state's rule changes and the limited timeline for implementation of the parking rules, public involvement is a challenging aspect of this project. Fortunately, with the 6-month timeline extension, staff will have some ability to conduct public involvement above and beyond the public hearing process. As you can see, we're concentrating on 2 main forms of public involvement. The first is broad outreach, like websites, emails, questionnaires, city newsletters, info sessions. And the second is focused engagement, where we would inform and consult with community stakeholders, including historically underrepresented communities. We're still working on fully scoping out the PI plan after only hearing that we received the extension last week, but we have already assembled a team to work on public involvement and have started initial conversations with a consultant who will assist in the implementation. I'll hand it back to Lydia.
All right, so now for the fun stuff. And again, this is where we're going to be looking for Planning Commission guidance. So option 1, which again is to not require off-street parking minimums for any development, which would be applied citywide. Staff are already drafting that code because it's relatively simple to draft. And the Planning Commission can certainly choose option 1 as the preferred option, or give guidance to staff that that is the preferred option. But even if that is the case, we are asking for further guidance on whether 2A or 2B would be the best fit for our city, because even with a 6-month extension, we still have a limited amount of time to draft the code, and both options 2A and 2B are pretty challenging to draft. So Reed did a good job of going into some of the details of these options. I've just simplified it a little bit in a table here. 2A, even though it looks kind of simpler because you choose 3 of 5, there's actually some pretty complicated requirements in here. And some of which would not even be regulated through the land use code, and the taxing parking lot revenue and then directing the funds to transportation alternatives is one of those things. It also has options for unbundling several other types of uses. So 2B, while it looked like, and there really are several things that are included in that, this is actually staff's recommended option, because 2B really can be summarized as repealing parking mandates, which are already part of some of the previous rules, for several additional uses in areas as is required in the parking reform, setting parking maximums in climate-friendly areas, and then again, designating at least 1 residential parking district where on-street parking is regulated through permits, payments, or time limits. So that concludes our presentation. Again, we know that was a lot of information, so we're all here to answer your questions. We've put the website where we're starting to populate that with information, as well as an email where people who have questions can send directly to that email box, and then staff are managing that to provide responses. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lydia. Looks like we have Commissioner Edwards in the queue. If we can take down the screen, I can see the commissioners easier. There we go. Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you guys so much for this presentation. I had a question mostly around the public involvement, public engagement process. I'm curious as to what specifically, so you're asking us to kind of give you direction between 2A and 2B. But I'm curious about, because it's very complex, as I'm even just looking at, that it's super complex. And I feel like asking the public to try to understand all of the implications. I mean, we're talking about taxing on one of these specific, right? So it becomes really complicated. And I'm just kind of curious, as we're moving through this process, what you all envision us recommending to council. Is it go with option 1, go with option 2B? Is it, you know, are we kind of going through a process to narrow it down, and then we'll be gathering public input? And then what is that public input going to be catered to extract from the public, if that makes sense? That's a lot of questions in one, so I apologize.
That's okay. I'll start, and then I think Reed can dive in with regards to the public improvement. He's leading that for the parking regulations. So you're right, Commissioner Edwards, that right now we are looking for guidance on, it's really about what code we should draft, in addition to option 1. We will come back to you for a recommendation on which path to take. So nothing that you say today with regards to guidance on which additional code to draft locks you into anything. So that's really what we're after here today. And then, as I say, we'll return for a specific request for a recommendation that we will take to City Council. I know that with public involvement, we haven't gotten into the details. Some of it is providing information on what the rules are, right? But you're right, the places where we have options, it's not just like, oh, you know, choose a pancake or choose some, you know, hash browns. It's really complicated. So I'm not sure that we've had enough time to go into the details, but I'll see if Reed has any additional comments. And it looks like Lauren also has her hand up.
Yeah, Lydia hit most of it. So if you want to go ahead, Lauren, that works with me.
Great, thanks, Reed. I'm going to agree with everything that Lydia said, but maybe add a little bit more detail. So what staff is asking for from Planning Commission tonight is, as Lydia said, guidance on which ordinance to draft, because even with the 6-month extension from DLCD, which we're very excited to get, it's still a very short period of time to draft and adopt these code amendments. And so staff needs to get going on drafting the proposed code kind of at the same time that public involvement is happening. If you'll remember back from middle housing, where we had more time, there was some initial public involvement, reaching out to the community to say, you know, to the extent that we had choices, what do you want these proposed code amendments to look like, community? And then we took that feedback and used it to draft the proposed code amendments, which then went through the formal adoption process. Here, we just simply don't have enough time to follow that same path. So we are going to have to be drafting at the same time that public involvement is going on. And as Lydia mentioned, the option 1, removal of parking mandates citywide, is relatively straightforward to draft. But either of the options 2 is going to take more time and be more complicated. And if we got to a point where, you know, we were before council, perhaps say Planning Commission recommended option 1, we had only drafted option 1, we got to council and council said, we don't want to do option 1. I don't think we'll have enough time to circle back from the beginning and redraft an option 2. So we are trying to kind of get ahead of the game. And so then the question becomes, you know, which of those options 2 should we move forward on? And that's where we're asking for guidance from Planning Commission. And as Lydia said, you know, nothing that happens tonight binds the Planning Commission in any way. We will go through the formal adoption process. You will have the ability to make a recommendation to council, and that recommendation can be whatever Planning Commission wants it to be. But we just need to get moving, and we need a little bit of guidance from Planning Commission on which of those options to start with. So that was a lot of words, but hopefully that is helpful. And as far as any community members who might be watching, there will be an opportunity to comment on all of the options, regardless of which draft code comes back to Planning Commission. The community has the opportunity to say, you know, which of the three options they're interested in and which of the options kind of within those options they're interested in, both during the initial public involvement process and the formal adoption process.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. I just want to say part of the reason I ask is because it's a lot of work for you all to be drafting even just these options. And I have pretty strong feelings about what I think, but I don't assume everyone, but I'm just wondering, because we haven't yet asked for public input, even to set that course, if it wasn't necessary, but I think it's probably in the public's best interest to at least have, a couple of options for them to weigh in on. So I get that. I feel bad because you all have a lot of work to do just to narrow it down.
Commissioner Bailey.
Thank you. I have several questions and some concerns. Some of this might be naive on my part, being a newbie, but everything that you're working on and we're working on, does this also apply to the university land, or is that all state controlled and exempt? Yes, it includes the university.
It includes all property within the city limits that's annexed, so not the unannexed properties. Yeah.
Okay. And there's references frequently to unbundling parking, which means parking spaces being paid for or leased in some way. Does that revenue come to the city or the property owner? Is this, I'm curious about why that's even in there. Does that increase revenue, the tax on parking lots, the unbundled parking? Is that money to the city?
It's not money to the city. The idea is that by unbundling the parking spaces, so if I don't own a vehicle and I want to rent a unit, I can rent a unit that doesn't include a parking space. So it would be less expensive for me to rent because parking is separate. And then somebody else who does want a parking space would rent a unit, and then it's like you'd rent the parking space separately. So it's actually intended to reduce the cost of housing and also to encourage people to use alternative modes of transportation.
Okay, thank you. There are also multiple references to climate-friendly areas. I found a document that had a definition of climate-friendly areas, and yet I feel like we're a little cart before the horse because we're not going to identify climate-friendly areas until a different project later on. And I know being out in an area that's removed, we would give our eye teeth to have a climate-friendly area here in Bethel. That's what we've been asking for. We have no amenities. I can't get anything without getting in a car. So I feel like there's a bit of a conflict there, if that's the way to put it. Because right now, it seems to me you have huge swaths of the city that don't have that benefit. Everything out west, everything north, the whole Santa Clara area, South Hills. So, how many climate-friendly areas do we actually have? A couple at the moment. It's confusing to me in a way that makes me wonder how much of all of this is going to have to be revisited.
So, Commissioner Bailing, I'll quickly jump in, and Alyssa, maybe you want to as well, that you are correct, that there are various phases to these climate-friendly and equitable communities rules, and parking is just the first of many phases. Staff is working through how we will address the upcoming phases, including a study to identify possible climate-friendly areas within the city of Eugene. We don't have any right now. It's a new concept. And eventual adoption of those climate-friendly areas. And when that happens, depending on the parking choices that City Council has made, there may be a need to go back and do some additional parking regulation related to the climate friendly areas, or not. You know, if option one is chosen and parking mandates are repealed citywide, then there wouldn't be a need for any additional repeals because it would already be done. So it is a multi-step process. You're right about that. And there will probably be some kind of repeat or revisiting some of these questions as staff and the Planning Commission and the City Council move through that process. Alyssa, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I understand. I think it's too bad. I feel like somehow because of the order of the regulations, you end up having a lot more work on your plates, and I'm sorry for that. But I also just wanted to add one comment that when public involvement is sought, other than the two methods that were listed on the slide, I would like to encourage you to have outreach to the neighborhood associations, because everyone everywhere will be impacted by this. Thank you.
Commissioner Beeson.
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions. Some comments. I may need a second round. First off, for Lydia and Reed, thank you very much for all the material you've prepared. And that goes clear back to August, also goes back to the material you prepared for the city work sessions. I think everything, really appreciate the kind of level of organization and how you've sort of put it together in terms of how it flows, because we've all observed, it's very clear, there's a lot of complexity here. There are stages. We're now focused on parking, but I definitely appreciated what you put together for this meeting in terms of how kind of laid out what the requirements are for the various options. So thank you very much. Also, I'd request, if you could, when you can, could you send us your slides so that we have those? A couple of a thought on the process that was discussed earlier. Well, I find myself, I went through this stuff in a bit of detail, which I kind of like to do. It occurs to me, what I'm hearing kind of loud and clear from you all, that option one, I don't want to say option one is easy, but what I'm kind of hearing is that it's more less complicated, and on a more timely basis, you can probably deliver code if that's what the council's looking for. So the focus is on option 2A and 2B, which are more complicated. When you've laid out the requirements really clearly on about 5 pages of your backgrounder, and it flows chronologically in terms of what we need to do now and on through to the end of 2023. And in kind of studying through those, it occurs to me, you've really got to draft amendments for pretty much everything till you get down to the end. There are 8 or 9 of what is like 25 or 30 requirements. There are some, whether you go with 2A or 2B, but for the most part, you're going to have to really draft everything up. It's sort of the way I'm reading it. And I'm thinking, initially what we're talking about under all of the options, we're going to remove minimum parking requirements from at least the transit areas. And I forgot from middle housing what share of the city that is, but it's a pretty good chunk of land right there. So I'm, and what I found myself thinking, and I've been listening to you very carefully, and I'm hearing you say that it's going to be really hard to do it all, and there's a time issue and so on. And I heard that, and I heard that from Lauren. What I've been thinking about for a couple, I'm going to go ahead and kind of say it. It strikes me as we go into this process, we're going to have a couple of planning commission meetings. We're going to head through to a process where we go through public hearing. We're going to have material prepared, and we're going to listen to the public, and then we're going to make a recommendation and move it on through to the city for their process, or the council for their process. The community is going to weigh in, which is clearly a big thing. And it strikes me, all things considered, at the end of the day, it might be good to have appropriate detail on everything. It may be that you get partway through the process if you said, oh, let's do 2B, and you leave out part of the tail end of 2A because we didn't quite have time, and you may get feedback pushing you that way, or vice versa. So there's a part of me, anyway, I'll just say, I think giving some consideration to, on all of the requirements, at least doing enough detailed work that we can talk clearly and in some critical level of detail with the community and the council and so on about all these various requirements. The other thing to say about it, just kind of quick, I tend to look at it all kind of optimistically, or maybe glass half full, and I should be really careful with that. But when I kind of swing down through them, I think a lot of these requirements are pretty good. I mean, they're kind of advantageous for the community. They don't appear to really harm a whole lot of people. And I'll be careful with the taxing one. And I know there'll be issues around some of them, but I find myself thinking, you know, as we move into this as a city, it might be good for us to look to do a lot of this, considering that we're going to have to get rid of the minimums in a pretty good share of the city. And then adding on some of these requirements, I don't know, it just seems like it might be beneficial. So if you twist my arm, I would probably go with 2B also. And if that's kind of where you guys are, I could really kind of go either way. But one last question, and then I'll stop. We went past the transit corridor slides pretty quickly. I thought I heard you say, Lydia, that you've gotten guidance on one of them. Are we going to have an opportunity to talk about those?
Yeah, what I said was, because the requirements go into effect on January 1st, the planning director is giving staff guidance, and that's going to be mostly Reed's team, that until we get in front of the city council, we will use that walking distance map, because it's the most conservative one, because it's more similar to the way the middle housing measurement was done. It was a different measurement. It was a 1/4 mile from MX stations.
Right, right. I remember.
So we're using that for now. That does not mean that you cannot provide feedback on that. And I think that would be part of your recommendation when we come back to you, that you can take to city council, because ultimately it's going to be the city council who determines which way we measure.
Okay. Well, thank you. I guess what I'd like to leave you with is I have several questions about it, and would like an opportunity at some point to kind of weigh in and talk with you guys. I don't know, either one-on-one about it or talk in this forum. And it's not particularly on whether we select the walking one or the flying one. It's more a little bit about these corridors and exactly how they're, you know, I know we went through it all with middle housing, but anyway, I'd like at some point some opportunity to come in with some questions on that. So thank you.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Fraggle, before you go, do you mind if I jump in really quickly? So just to be clear, Commissioner Beeson and the rest of the commission, staff is asking for your recommendation on which measurement to use in the code language that we will draft. So starting January 1st, staff is going to be required to apply these Oregon administrative rule requirements, but we won't have incorporated that language into our code yet, but we do plan to, as part of the amendments that will become effective, no later than December 31st, 2023. And so for the the ordinance that we're drafting, we would like Planning Commission's recommendation on which measurement method to use. But in the interim, staff will be using, beginning January 1st, the walking distance measurement, because they're going to need to start applying those OAR requirements, and we won't have a code amendment yet.
Well, let me thank you for that, and I'm going to stop here in just a quick second. I can do that, and that all makes sense. Some of my particular questions have a little more to do with how we got these corridors set up in the first place, where they come from, how firm are they, subject to change? Are they subject to change over the next couple of years? Do they change with the population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And because I sit and look at them, and I think what we're trying to accomplish with some of this stuff is to find ways to orient our transit corridors with respect to where we might want density as a city to allow for affordable small A housing. And so let me leave it at that. I'm going on a bit. I'll stop there. Thank you.
And I will just say that frequent transit corridors for this purpose are defined in the Oregon administrative rules. And so the city has a limited amount of flexibility as to how we define frequent transit corridors for the purpose of the climate-friendly parking rules. So the map that you see reflects the definitions in the Oregon administrative rules. And similar to middle housing, the way that it will come back to the city in ordinance is a static map that is adopted by the city council. And then if later the definitions change, or LTD creates new frequent transit corridors that meet the definition in the OAR, the city council would need to amend the code and update the map. Commissioner Fragala, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Commissioner Fragala.
Thank you. So I just want to clarify that today we are making a recommendation on a potential second option for drafting, but that once we receive public input and information, we get farther down the process, we are absolutely able to change that direction, correct? Okay, so we're not making a recommendation for council. So I'm very curious about, well, first of all, nobody's like expressed a preference yet, so I'm just going to go for it. I have a strong preference for option one. I think, beyond being an easier approach, that's not for that reason at all, but in terms of the potential impact for moving our city towards climate friendly and reducing that the transportation related pollution. I do think it may potentially be the strongest option. But that's what I would like information on. What are the pros and cons in terms of achieving the outcomes of reducing the transportation related pollution from each of these models? I mean, do they have the exact same outcome? When I look at 2A and 2B, like I found your chart really helpful, that chart at the end. But there's a whole bunch of other parking requirements that for option 2 that you have to do, and then you get to A and B, right? So there's all these other options we have to do anyway. So I'm just curious, like, how would you respond to that? Which one, like, what are the pros and cons of each of the 2A, 2B approaches in terms of achieving reduction of transportation pollution and the impacts on historically marginalized communities in equity?
It's a great question, and I don't think it's one we're prepared to answer at this point in terms of the impacts on climate for each different option. I will say, and then anybody else can jump in, obviously, that from the state's perspective, from an equity standpoint, it seems that option one is the most equitable in that the entire city is treated the same way. So again, if you look at that the frequent transit corridor map, you'll see that a significant portion of the city is already having parking minimums eliminated. And so that would be one way to look at it. But honestly, that analysis in terms of which one would have the most benefit from a greenhouse gas reduction, I don't think we've done that analysis. And I don't know, Alyssa, if your team hasn't gotten it.
And I'm sure it's a very challenging analysis. And so I would be curious to know, is anybody doing it, right? What are other communities doing? Like, who else is looking at this information?
We may be able to check with the state. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's great. Yes, please.
But the state might have some information for us on that, and then we can report that back to you.
Okay. And then, just one last thought would be, when we think about climate friendly and equitable communities, right? The equitable communities part is not that it's just equitable for everybody. It's about certain specific communities, right? That we are considering a way to address the impacts that those communities have had historically. And so I will say, when I look at 2A, right, some of those options, like unbundling parking, like you said, it reduces housing costs for our community, requiring employers to provide a benefit. That might be something that would really assist some members of our community. And, tax parking lot revenues that go to transportation alternatives, it's one of the few things that I think actually makes investments in alternative transportation. So I love all the bike stuff, that you get to just replace parking spaces with alternatives. But I feel like it's hard for me to get a sense between 2A and 2B. And I know you're looking for a direction tonight, but I don't know if I have a lot to base it on, honestly, at this point.
So I want to put myself in the queue, Commissioner Ramey, if you don't mind. And I don't know how much staff is wanting really granular questions about some of the stuff. So forgive me if we're going to get too granular here. But we mentioned, for example, that some of the options included that if we were going to have the unbundling of next to multifamily units, and we're going to have requirements for them. What about existing units? I mean, we're only looking at adding 9,000 units of housing as our goal over the next 10 years. That's 900 units per year. So if we're trying to attack our goal, which we're wildly off from the beginning of your slides, there has to be some conversation about the existing multifamily. So if I know that part of code is if you were to, for example, open a wall and fix something in the wall, you have to bring everything in the wall up to code when you close it. So given that parking is already built outside, where does this starting point begin in these plans for adding an EV option for existing multifamily units?
So I can speak to that one a little bit. The EV one is for new construction. The unbundling requirements, there's been some verbal guidance provided by DLCD, but we're still waiting for written guidance. But it's sounding like the indication is that that applies to existing and new development as well. So we're still waiting for some additional guidance, like we said, on that, because it's going to be coming down to an enforcement matter for existing multifamily and existing commercial developments that lease out spaces to tenants. So yeah, we're still not exactly sure how that would function, and we don't know where it would go in the code, which is one of the challenging portions for the 2A option.
Okay. The next question I have is on the unbundling. We mentioned that it potentially, the goal is for it to reduce rent. Do we have any data that that actually works? The reason I'm asking is I live in an apartment complex that has this option, and it does not decrease the rent. There's about a quarter of the spaces that are available to rent. I rent one of them. None of the advertisements for the rent is if you want to use parking that's provided that is not covered, for example, it would be a lesser rent charge than if you want to pay for additional parking. And I've asked 3 of my other friends who have similar living situations around the city, and they're all exactly the same. So my fear is that our hopes and dreams would be that this would be offer a way for housing to come down in price, but ultimately what it would be a revenue stream for a new revenue stream for existing multifamily to then charge tenants for what they're already using in parking. So what data do we have that shows that this is actually going to happen?
And there have been some studies done, don't have in front of me right now, that have indicated that not providing mandatory parking with all units does lower the cost. I know that we had some discussions with developers who talked about their process of when they do build new structures. If they don't have parking provided, then they do a market test, and it'll typically be lesser rent than spaces nearby that do allow or do provide parking. So yeah, the idea would be that it would lower prices, but we don't have those studies in front of us today.
Okay.
And that said, Commissioner Isaacson, you make a good point, because the way that the Oregon administrative rules define unbundled parking is exactly as Reed has described. They're charged separately, the space and the unit. But the OARs only require that the parking space must be rented, leased, or sold at market rates for comparable local off-street parking. It doesn't speak to the housing unit cost. And so all the administrative rules are regulating is the cost of the parking space, not the cost of the housing unit. So I think that it is true that there probably is a cost savings to a developer not having to create parking, but the way that the OARs are developed, they're not focusing on the cost of the unit. They are focusing on the cost of the parking space.
Right. The other 2 things I was going to mention, I mean, Commissioner Freckler really, and Commissioner Beeson really detailed a lot of what I was going to say. I mean, on the public engagement side of the equation, it makes me very uneasy after we came out of HB 2001 to go down a pathway which we really don't have a North Star here. There's 3 different pathways that have a lot of fingers out that need to be fleshed out. We don't have the data that you're looking for to be able to get that, and we're under a very reduced timeline. So if we were to say we want to do option A and option 2A as our chosen preference to start work on, then we go through the public engagement process, and it turns out the public is really for 2B. There isn't time to then circle the wagons and develop the plan for it. So to a degree, it's a bit of a misnomer for the public engagement process to begin with, because we're asking for your input as long as you agree with what we've gone and done so far. Because if you don't agree with it, we don't have the time to develop what you want, which kind of, I can see from the public's perspective, would irritate them greatly. So it is challenging from at least from my perspective, to give guidance on what this is, minus the public engagement process, unless we're going into it by saying that there isn't time on these 2 things. So your options are only what we are going to start the process after we have already made our guidance, if that makes sense, right? So you won't have the ability to give us your thoughts on, as far as John Q. Public, on options A, B, and C. It's only after we've chosen from A, B, and C the 2 options that we're walk down the pathway with, if that makes sense.
Commissioner Isaacson, if I may, I take your point. In my mind, especially with the 6-month extension, it would be tight. But I think if so say staff drafted code for option 1 and option 2A. And then at the Planning Commission public hearing, there was an outpouring from the public that said, no, we really like option 2B. Again, it would be tight, but I think there would still be time at that point to pivot and to move to option 2B instead. What I am concerned about is waiting until we get to the council public hearing and then having to pivot. And I don't think that's possible. I think we could probably pivot from either of the options 2 to option 1 at that point, but I don't think we could pivot from option 1 to either of the options 2. And so I understand what you're saying. I think it will be really important for staff to make sure that the public isn't under the perception that they are being limited to those 2 choices, to really convey that Planning Commission and the city are still asking for input on all 3 choices. We have only drafted 2 of them, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't pivot to the 3rd one if that's where the public wants us to go, and that's where Planning Commission wants us to go. So that's why we're asking for guidance tonight, to kind of help staff get started, to not force staff to fully draft 3 different ordinances that are very different in a bunch of ways, to kind of get the ball rolling, to give the public something to comment on, but with the understanding that, at least as far as Planning Commission is concerned, there is still an opportunity for the public to weigh in on, well, throughout there's an opportunity for the public to weigh in on all 3 options, but there is still time for the public to weigh in on all 3 options and for Planning Commission to recommend the 3rd option be the one to go to council.
Yeah, for one, I'm glad you got the extension too, because I can't imagine if you hadn't got it. But I would say, and part of the feedback that you wanted was on types of outreach, and I would say front load as much of as you possibly can, so that you're checking that box to be able to say we went out and got feedback to be able to get to council before we're starting the process of really getting as much feedback as we're going to anticipate. That's all I have. Commissioner Ramey.
Well, thank you. Before I begin any detailed comments, I would like to congratulate the staff for getting the extension. I mean, we just kind of blew by that, but that was a lot. I'm sure that was a lot of work. And I know from watching the council meeting that you had been requesting extensions for a while and not being successful. So it was great that you were able to prevail. You must have done a great job, and thank you for that hard work. In my experience in planning, there is one issue that brings everyone to a meeting, and that issue is parking. And they come fully loaded with all the emotions across the spectrum. And unfortunately, not much of the common sense across the spectrum. So I know the council has an impossible job in front of them. And I know that they will be deciding, and really what we can do is try to be as helpful as we can as we put our process together. It's a very complicated problem. And as I said, it's charged with emotion. And I kind of regret the whole thing, but I almost regret that we were given 3 choices, because really it's almost like someone is punishing us because even when you look at options 2A and 2B, they're sort of, well, I kind of like a part of this one, but maybe a part of that one. But then I'm not allowed to make option 2C. So it's very difficult for me. And so my sense is on 2 different levels. One is we cannot possibly choose between these 3 options and go forward with a straight face and begin every meeting by saying, well, we were given 3 options, and just to make it simpler for you, we chose these 2. I can tell you right away, in my experience, the meeting comes to a halt, you've lost all credibility, and you're going to spend the rest of the time digging out of that hole. So, but unfortunately, in a time crunch that we're in, I don't know how I can give you a better answer than that. But the only thing I can say is that if I could, I would keep all 3 alive, even if it was in a skeleton way somehow, sort of marshaling our time so that could work. Because I'm so concerned that we're going to turn off anybody who wants to comment on it when we come to the meeting and say, well, but we thought, maybe these two were better than that one. So therefore, we've done some thinking for you. That just doesn't work very well, in my experience, in a public process. So,
Commissioner Ramey, can I just clarify, and maybe it's ask you a question, but with regards to going out to the public, what guidance you give us tonight doesn't mean we only take option 1 and 2, whatever planning commission says, right? The public involvement will still provide all 3 options, right? I just want to make sure that that's clear, and that maybe what you're saying is that by the planning commission giving some direction might feel to the public. So if that's the case, then then I understand what you're saying.
What you're asking us to do and what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Anyone who reads the meeting will see that.
Yeah.
But yes, that would be ideal. And so it's more, you want us to read the crystal ball so you can, and very reasonably, you can focus your time on what we think is going to be the best solution. And if I had to answer that tonight, I don't have the information. I mean, Commissioner Fregola's points about which one of these reduce emissions more than the others, some of them don't have anything to do with reducing emission. They have to do with making the parking more efficient. It'll be more efficient the way we use it. It won't make people drive less, but just have fewer empty parking spaces. So it's a puzzle to me. And as many of us have said, I'm sorry we're in this position. And I really strongly believe that number 1 is the elegant solution that sort of goes across all parts of the city. The problem it has is in spillover parking. So if you're in a high density residential, high density commercial, or high density use, and you're a residential user next to that use, your streets will, and I just know this from experience, your streets will fill up with cars because those people can park on your street for free and walk and get a little exercise. And all of a sudden there's no place to park in front of your house. And that doesn't really make people very happy either. So, but we do have residential parking programs. So if there's any way we can bundle these 2 things together, or as part of the messaging, we can say, okay, here's what the state's requiring us to do, and here's some tools we have to mitigate what we think are going to be the adverse effects of those. And then, unfortunately, Lauren, you ruined my one idea probably of the month, which was, is there any way we could do a sliding scale on the parking? It doesn't say how much you have to charge for it. It just says you have to charge. So if you could slide it, and so that if you paid $100 in rent per month, then your space cost $1. And if you paid $5,000, then your space costs $50. And that would get at some of the equity stuff. But it sounds like you said it has to be based on the market in the neighborhood, in the neighboring areas. So no luck there. Okay. And then finally, I've probably said finally 3 times, but finally, option 2. So I like unbundling as a concept for commercial parking. It's not really working for me for residential. And in option 2, there's a residential component even before you get to the initials. There's an option 2, no matter what you do, you have to do an unbundling for residential. And so for that reason, I'd be like, well, then let's really focus on option 1. But I don't want to do a public process where we've already tipped our hand, where we've assumed that we know what's going on. But we just have to be careful how we say, well, we don't know what's going on, but we're focusing our efforts in this direction because it seems more likely that will happen. If we can somehow soften our approach that way, I think we might have more success. Well,
Commissioner Lear is next.
Yes, thank you very much. And I am in transit to the holidays as a passenger, and so that's why I don't have my video on. Please excuse that, and as well as any background noise. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay. So I just wanted to echo the comments of Commissioner Fragola in particular, and I think that's been kind of the theme. It's definitely difficult to parse through these complex options. I have a very strong preference for option 1 as well, and just wanted to go on and say that and express that. I am curious as well. I'm going to take a slightly different angle on from environmental impact, because I think that is a really important point and it's been well covered. And I guess to ask the question of, for example, in the unbundling, does that create a new regulatory regime, or is there any concern about one of these approaches creating a more complex regulatory environment for developers of multifamily? It's definitely a concern of mine, creating any hurdles to the development of housing given the situation in our community. So I was just curious if there was enforcement mechanisms, for example, on that unbundling and how that worked.
Commissioner Lear, I'll let Lydia or Reed speak to whether or not it would truly create a hurdle for development of new multifamily. But in terms of enforcement mechanisms for unbundled parking, I think, staff will need to look into it more deeply. But in terms of new development, it is possible that the unbundling could be a condition of approval. So could be perhaps wrapped into the land use approval. If unbundling is required to be applied to existing multifamily, we don't have a mechanism in the land use code to do that. So the enforcement would be, it would become a code enforcement issue, like noise complaints or other types of code enforcement or rental housing code, et cetera. And so that would be staffed from our code enforcement folks. It would live in a different chapter of the code. So in that sense, it would be a new kind of regulatory scheme because that's not something that exists in our code right now.
Follow-up question. So how would you then, even for those new developments, ensure that that was happening after approval without, some type of oversight or, agency looking into it? I mean, is there a complaint mechanism? Does it create civil actions? How does this work?
It's a great question, Commissioner Lear. Typically for a code enforcement scheme, it's a complaint-driven process. And so our code enforcement folks, we just don't have the manpower typically to be kind of out actively looking for code violations. If a complaint comes in, then they will be investigated. In terms of, if this was a condition of approval through the land use code, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that would work or if that would work, because it really depends on whether there's a land use application associated with the development or if it's an outright permitted use. We may or may not have mechanisms for a condition of approval through a land use process.
And how would code enforcement be able to determine if charges are being reasonable for parking? I mean, a market rate for parking is dependent on the neighborhood. It depends on a lot of different factors. Is there the ability within planning and code to do this?
Another great question. I think, we would need to look through the OARs more deeply to see if they give any more guidance about, kind of what the market rate is and how we determine that. If they don't, then the city might have to adopt some regulations about how we determine what market rate is and whether someone is charging appropriately. So again, yes, that regulatory scheme could kind of balloon depending on how much information we need to include in the city's code provisions and potentially administrative rules or other regulations.
I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Commissioner Edwards, you have a second round.
Yes, thank you. So as I think about, kind of trying to narrow down this decision, I always kind of imagine, policymakers, council, they hear from everyone, everything, right? So you have to think about like, well, what are the factors when you have, okay, you go out and you get feedback from a community and they basically tell you, do this, do that, do this. And so there's not a clear, concise direction. And so I always have to ask myself, well, what if everyone says something different? What then do you base your decision on? So if the public weighs in and they're all over the place, it's a constant thing that I try to think about, how do I feel about it? And So I guess that's where trying to narrow down at this point without any engagement from the public to even know if there's, you know, as I continue to listen to the conversation and staff's responses to things, I mean, there are so many potentially unintended consequences when you're pulling little tiny levers trying to make a difference. And I just feel like it's just there, it could be riddled with, I mean, there's not even enforcement mechanisms on some of it. And when, you know, taxing, that's a whole thing. So I guess when I think about it, I would like to understand the implications beyond just the code. So, you know, okay, here's the code for 2A, here's the code for 2B. Well, what then beyond that does it look like? What kind of staff resources are required to actually follow through on implementing the three things, or, you know, the other things with 2B? That's what would be helpful for me to understand, that just like Lauren explained, well, if we do this unbundling, there really isn't a way to get at that issue if it's a complaint driven policy, or, you know, something like that. So I guess that's kind of where I'm at, and having a hard time just trying to figure out, you know, why and what are the incentives to go narrow, you know, with a 2A or 2B option. I mean, what would be the reason that you wouldn't just be able to simplify? Because I don't want to be lazy about it. I don't want to say, well, we just want to make it easy and, you know, we don't want to have to do all this work. But as I think about it, it's well beyond just rewriting a code. It's many other departments that would have to be involved. And so I guess I'm just kind of looking for feedback on the complexity beyond just the drafting of the code. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you raise some really good points. And again, I feel frustrated that we don't have better answers for you, because I wish I could say 2B is, or not to be, 2B is so much simpler because it's only reducing parking minimums, you know, but it's not, because you have those, whichever two you pick, and it includes unbundling. And we've talked about that a little bit, but we really haven't gotten beyond. It would have to be a code enforcement, and we do have some things and some new rules that have come through that we're not quite sure how we're going to know if there's a violation or not. And, you know, we, as a rule, we don't take enforcement action unless we can verify that there is, you know, a code violation. And so that is really tricky. So I'm hoping one of my peers just has it all figured out. But, you know, really the way that we looked at it is, like you said, in 2A, there are requirements that just go beyond the scope of the planning and development department, right? We don't do taxing. We actually, you know, parking regulation is within planning and development. So, you know, we can do that, you know, maybe not my shop or Alyssa's shop, but that is something that, you know, parking, the parking program lives in PDD, but other ones of these options are outside of our bailiwick. We don't even know, and I don't know, Lauren, if you've kind of figured out, but like where we would go to figure out where do we even place that and how do we manage that?
And I'll just bring up, thank you, and I apologize, but I'll just bring up like requiring the taxes on a revenue that would then have to be dedicated to transportation alternatives to drive alone travel. That's not just within the city. That's not even, you know, so then you're involving other agencies or other governmental bodies. I just feel like it really gets complicated. And I guess I'm asking, why would we want to make it complicated? Maybe we're just gluttons for punishment, I guess. I don't know. Why would we want to make it complicated? I do believe that we heard a lot in the middle housing process that, you know, from developers and folks who, I mean, because this is on future development. This isn't, you know, necessarily on anything in the built environment now, but I think we heard over and over again that removing parking requirements doesn't remove parking. It just does not, it just says the code isn't what drives the outcomes. And instead, the demand and the need for parking in a particular area, you know, I think people recognize that there's electric vehicles out there that are pretty widespread. And I think that people want to be able to rent to someone with an EV or whatever. I just think that it figures itself out. But I digress. I know we're trying to find a second option beyond one that could be a clear second choice for me, but I don't see one right now.
Before we get to Commissioner Bailey, I'm going to throw myself back in the queue again before going. And it looks like a second round for everybody. I don't know, and maybe staff can help us out here. It doesn't feel like any of us have a clear second choice that is rising to the top here. How do you perceive us moving forward? You want us to just take a straw poll? Is that what you're? Like I said, I'm not seeing anybody coming up with a cohesive argument that everyone is drafting towards, other than saying option one is where we're all kind of settling on. So, what is staff suggestion here? Because I think we can go round robin on our thoughts on why A and B are not great choices with the information we have all night.
So, Commissioner Isaacson, I appreciate that synopsis. I can jump in and tell you what I am thinking, but then Alyssa, Lydia, Reed, please jump in with your own thoughts if they differ from mine. So part of the reason that we as staff are trying to figure out what to draft is because, as you know, to start the formal land use adoption process, we need to send language to DLCD saying, this is how we're planning to amend the code. And throughout the process of the formal adoption process, we can make changes to that proposed code language, and they can be very big changes. It could swing during the formal adoption process from option one to one of the other options. And there's provision for additional notice that has to go out, if that happens, but that is contemplated by the formal adoption process. But we have to notify DLCD. We have to send notice of the proposed code for the Planning Commission public hearing. So we need to land on something that we can send out to folks. And based on what I'm hearing tonight from Planning Commission, it sounds like if a preference can be expressed, the preference that I have heard expressed is for option one. But there is some interest in learning more about the impact of both of the options from a climate change perspective, from an equity perspective, from a staff workload perspective, from a code change perspective, how those would sort of play out in the community in a little bit more detail than we were able to give you tonight. And so I guess my suggestion would be that staff could move forward with option one as the proposed code that goes to DLCD and that is noticed for the public hearing, and at the same time create something similar to the code concepts that were presented to Planning Commission for middle housing, to sort of give Planning Commission a better idea of, so for 2A, here are generally the code sections that would need to be amended. Here are some of the consequences of choices that we can foresee, at least at this point. Here is, to the extent that we know, our best guess about greenhouse gas emissions impact, our best guess about equity impact, understanding that we will be hearing from the public on all of those issues as we kind of move through the adoption process. And that would put staff in a position of having, moved the needle at least some portion toward drafting those other two code options without having to do all of the work of drafting those other two code options. So if the input from the public is, very strongly toward, say, option 2A, and that is something that Planning Commission is interested in too, your recommendation could be option 2A goes to council, and we could hopefully have enough time to turn that around and put the actual code language together. So that's my thought. Alyssa, Lydia, Reed, does that sound like something that could work for you? And with the caveat that I don't want to stifle discussion tonight. I think any additional information from Planning Commission is going to be helpful to staff as we move forward. Everybody's nodding, so
yeah, I'll chime in with a little more here. I think that was a great summary of where I'm at as well, and I think I'm hearing that preference for option 1 as well, and that we just haven't really been able to get enough information to provide the logic to choose between 2A or 2B. And we are struggling with that as well as staff, just figuring out where different provisions would live in the code, how we would handle it enforcement wise. That's the biggest challenge with 2A. 2B does have a little chunk of unbundling, so we would have to deal with that too. It's not as extreme as all multifamily and all commercial throughout the city, but it is unbundling close to the transit corridors and by climate friendly areas. The rest of 2B is removing mandates for certain uses and developing a parking district, which is things that we can accomplish. We can draft code to satisfy those obligations. So that has been the preference of the staff, is going towards 2B, just because it seems like it's more doable than 2A, but we have not had time to do the studies to figure out really what the impacts as far as climate or staff time on the differences between 2A or 2B. And I wish we had the time to do that so we could provide a little more direction about what each one of those options would look like when implemented. And we'll get to work on that and see what we can find out going forward.
Commissioner Bailey, you were had your hand in the queue, and I don't know.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. I do feel that Lauren did a very appropriate summary in that I'm feeling like we're making or being asked to make an uninformed judgment, and we really need information on those impacts, as Commissioner Fragla said, about the pollution reduction, and the statement originally was that 38% of Oregon's climate pollution is related to transportation. I wonder if we have any statistical information about Lane County and the city of Eugene. Does that apply for Eugene as well? We're a very biking community. Is our pollution also 38% from transportation, or is it 22%? And therefore, when we apply these changes, the formula of pollution reduction is going to be different. So that's a big question for me. And having more information about all the other impacts as well, the cost, the implementation, what it would take, the complexity of it. So given all those unknowns, shooting in the dark, I want to change direction and say I would be in favor of 2A strictly because it has a benefit for employees. Companies with more than 50 employees, there's a benefit for employees. So working folks get a benefit there. I'm in favor of that. Thank you.
Commissioner Beeson.
Thanks. I didn't say initially, and I've been given what a couple of people have said. I want to echo. I am in favor of option 1. The only caveats are I want to continue to hear from my colleagues on the Planning Commission, and I definitely want to hear from the public. But I've tilted towards option 1 from the start, and I continue to be there. And back to what we're doing. One of the things I tried to say initially was it would be good if we can at least have enough material prepared by staff on each of the options, that material can be supplied to the public so that they can have some pretty clear compare and contrast kinds of discussions. And I heard from Lauren the words code concepts. I'm recalling that when we did it in middle housing, maybe something like that. I guess the other thing I'd kind of suggest, and I'd certainly be willing to do, I think we continue to talk about the short time frame and the burden on staff and so on. I think we all have to kind of lean into this, which I know we're doing. I'm assuming, I guess I want to clarify with Lydia and Reed, we're going to come back and hear from you on more detailed proposals before material is sent out to the public for the Planning Commission public hearing. I've been kind of assuming there would be some sort of work session intermediate to that. And I guess assuming that's going to happen, and let's say something could happen even in January or February, to the extent some of this could be fleshed out a little bit more, we could have some additional discussion amongst this group. I guess I just sort of agree with all the discussion. We really need to, when we go to the public, make them feel like they should feel like they've really got some choices there. I agree with all that. I became a little more comfortable when I heard Lydia and Chris, or Commissioner Ramey exchange, that what we're gonna have coming back to us and what's going to end up going out to the public is, I guess enough information about the three choices that people can give, that we can give direction, and so can the public. So I'm thinking it might be good to have another work session in the next couple of months and go, or sooner, and continue through this in some detail. Thanks.
Commissioner Beeson, I'm just going to jump in because I think Lydia will have something to say in response to your comments, but I will just say, it's my understanding that because the DLCD time extension is so new, it was only approved earlier this week. The time all runs together, not very long ago. That I don't think staff has had time to kind of sit down and think about what the new deadlines mean and how much room there is for public involvement, additional planning commission work sessions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we hear that is something that you would like in advance of a public hearing. I honestly don't know, even with a 6-month extension, I'm not sure if there's time, to be frank. And in part, that's because there's a fair amount of staff work that's going to need to happen before a planning commission hearing, or before staff can come back to you with all of the information that you've requested tonight, whether that's at the planning commission hearing or whether that's at a work session prior to the hearing. And so, that needs to be accounted for as well. And then we're into kind of first quarter of next year. And so staff needs some time to kind of game out all of those timelines. So I don't know at this point we can promise an additional work session, but I think we hear that would be something that you would like.
Yeah, I'm not asking for any promise of a work session. I'm just suggesting. I mean, I've heard Alyssa talk about this a bit. I mean, if we assume the deadline is the end of next year, and the council would have to act, let's say for just fun, we'll say they have to act in November, and we back it up from there, we're probably going to have a public hearing for the Planning Commission in the, I don't know what, August or September timeframe in order to get our recommendation. And again, I'm not asking you to detail out dates or anything tonight, but there's going to be at some point prior to that, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to prepare everything and it's going to come to us and the public at the same time. There'll be a public hearing, and then we will deliberate and recommend, or we'll have an opportunity to review it one time before it goes. So I'm, to the extent that can be worked out in a schedule, that would be great.
So we're up to Commissioner, I believe Commissioner Edwards is next, right? But before we did that, we're getting into round 3. I want to do a time check here. We're at 7:10. So I'm still kind of back to where we were before, which is there's it seems to be the same number of opinions that what we have isn't sufficient. What is the plan for tonight going forward? Do you need a recommendation tonight? If so, how do we direct you on that? What are you looking for from us? A straw poll. You have our initial thoughts, I think, through 2 rounds of comments so far. If you need something specific from me, obviously option 1 and 2B would be my very soft preference. Very soft.
I wonder if, I think Commissioner Isaacson, you may, or someone may have suggested a straw poll. And I'm just throwing out ideas here because I appreciate Lauren's comments from before. We got the timeline extension on November 15th. So that was a few business days ago. So we haven't really mapped out the schedule. So, I know we can't promise anything, though we certainly can look at, being able to come back to you with more information. But as Lauren and others, I'm actually not one of the lucky people drafting the code as they are the ones who are doing that work. I'm guessing even a straw poll, if we can do something like that, like you just said, option 1 and 2A or 2B, or not to be softly. I mean, that would be really helpful information for us moving forward. And if Reed or Alyssa or Lauren have thoughts about that, feel free to jump in. But
okay, well then I have Commissioner Ramey, Commissioner Edwards, and Commissioner Fregala that have raised their hands. Do either of you have a comment on going on the process going forward, or speaking to kind of the dilemma that we're in? If I would say, if it's speaking to comments about which options are preference, let's bypass that and go on to your ideas on moving forward. Otherwise, we can go to a straw poll. Does that sound appropriate for everyone? I'm getting head nods here. Lisa?
I did have a clarification question that's not particularly important, but I would like it answered at some point.
Okay. Do you want to do it now real quick? Get out of the way?
Sure. Option 2 includes bundling, whether you have the initials or not. So I just want to be clear that we can't do option 2 without getting into some kind of unbundling.
yeah, that's right. As Reed mentioned, either option 2 has the options above it.
Right.
But the unbundling for 2B are much less extensive, right, Reed? In terms of the uses that they apply to.
But you still have to do.
You have to do it for, is it multifamily, Reed? You can speak to that.
But there's no unbundling.
Reed, you're muted.
Sorry about that. We choose either option 2, multifamily units near transit corridors must be unbundled. If we choose 2A, then it's all multifamily and also all commercial that it's leased spaces for unbundling.
Okay. Commissioner Fregala, do you have something to the issue itself, or more toward like a process going forward?
Yes.
Great. Commissioner Fregala.
And so I heard Lauren articulate that what we need is to be able to draft code to provide an option to the state to move the process forward. I've heard the majority of people, not everybody, but many of us support option 1. She said that we could recommend moving forward with option 1, and then this idea of for both other options, creating code concepts similar to middle housing, which aligns with what Commissioner Beeson said about having a skeleton structure or enough materials for both options. I don't feel like I can go on the record tonight supporting A or B. I can go on the record supporting option 1 and moving forward in that manner that I heard Lauren articulate earlier tonight.
So how about that? Is that in the form of a motion?
Not necessarily, but I don't know. I mean, I would be curious to hear what other people think about that.
I would support that. Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. So what I was going to say, and then there's a question here, is that as I think about the driving force that leans me towards one option beyond one, I like the idea of having flexibility around not just targeting residential, because I think that, people want to have, if they want to have a car, they need to have a place to park it where they live. But if they're going to Target, or if they're going to to work, or some of those other places that aren't necessarily where they live,
right,
reducing parking in those places makes more sense to me than saying, we're going to be limiting all the residential development. Because I actually don't think that creates other problems, and that's where you get the streets all clogged up. And so for me, it's about trips, and it's about, when you think about what the policy is going to do on the ground, you want it to reduce people getting in their car and going to their errands, not necessarily that they're not going to have a car. I think that's an unrealistic expectation at this point in time. So anything that has the kind of flexibility that allows us to be more restrictive with specific things like that, that's where I would lean towards. And I think it looks like 2B, in my opinion, is probably more so, but I could be wrong. That's the only thing I've got that I would go by at this moment. So I would go with 2B if I had to vote right now.
So again, we need to get to some sort of a definitive action here in the remaining 13 minutes that we have in the meeting. So I'm just going to go ahead and make the motion that, that Commissioner Fregola has kind of articulated, as well as coming off of Lauren's suggestion, that we are recommending. I move that the Eugene Planning Commission's approve that recommend softly, as a softball, the option 1 with a more flushed out second tier explanation of option A and B through code language and at a future date and time. Does that summarize essentially what you were saying, Laura?
I think it does. Commissioner Isaacson, I want to offer that I don't know that we need a motion. I'm hearing a lot of concern from planning commissioners about not having enough information to really make a decision. And so if folks are not wanting to kind of get to the point of taking a vote tonight, I think that's okay. I don't think staff needs a motion and a vote from planning commission. I think we could do a couple of different things. I still feel like, Commissioner Edwards, I understand that your preference would be 2B. Overall, I think I've heard a majority of a preference for option 1. So I think staff could just take that information at this point and run with it, or alternatively, we could do a series of straw poll votes that would also kind of give staff information, but not commit planning commissioners to any particular course of action. And we could just say, and you could vote more than once. Who is at this point in time generally interested in option 1? Who is at this point in time generally interested in 2A, 2B? And that would give staff some information about the number of planning commissioners that have interest in a particular option, to kind of help us going forward with the clear understanding that you have requested a lot more information and that we have not yet heard from the public on any of these options. So maybe I might suggest that series of straw poll votes just to kind of let folks express their preference in a numerical way that staff can write down, and that gives us some guidance going forward without having to make an official recommendation by the body.
Well, the votes that I've heard said thus far have been a general plurality toward option A, or option 1, and then the next one is that they don't have enough information to be able to give you to people to center on either A or B, but people have said B more than A. So it sounds like if you're looking for a majority of us on any one direction, it's option 1, and get us more information on both so that we can make a determination at a future date. That's where I'm seeing nodding heads across my entire screen. So if you're looking for direction without a vote from us, there's your direction.
I think we hear that. I mean, I think that is, Lydia, Alyssa, Reed, you can nod your heads. I think that's our plan, to move forward with drafting language for option 1 with the understanding that that will probably be the thing that is provided to DLCD, but also to bring back information about the other 2 options to Planning Commission based on the comments that we've heard tonight about greenhouse gas emission effects, equity effects, how it will change the code, staff requirements, all that stuff. And with the understanding that we are expecting and hoping for public comment on anything and everything. And then at some point, we will get to a point in the formal adoption process where Planning Commission makes their actual recommendation, and you're not bound by anything that happens tonight in that actual recommendation process. I think so yes, staff will move forward with that plan. The only other question is whether planning commissioners want more of an opportunity to express a preference at this point for any of the options. If they do, then I think that series of straw poll votes makes sense. If they don't, then I don't think we need to do any more, and we can just move forward with that plan.
Does anybody have any objections to what we have just given in terms of direction to staff? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I just want to be clear that as we message this, the state gave us a short deadline, which forces us to make a choice we would not normally choose in order to sort of have a placeholder so we can get work done and meet that deadline. The placeholder in no way commits us to any of the 3 options. It is simply a bureaucratic technique to let us keep going forward and meet the deadline. We're going forward with 3 options to the public. And that, I just want to be clear, that's, if we can message it that way, if people are comfortable with that, I think that's closer to what we're doing. We're giving them the, well, more likely to be this one, so we can keep our place in line and, you know, keep all the paperwork moving, but we're going to do a process and sort it out.
Okay, I think that we'll move on from that. Now we're on to item D, other items from staff.
I'm happy to jump in. I want to make sure that there were no other comments or feedback you needed to give us on that, or we're moving ahead, and I can go. I'll happy to go forward with my planning director updates. So I just on your upcoming schedule, your next meeting is December 6th, public hearing and possible recommendation on a code amendment related to the Skinner Butte height limit. And your last meeting at the end of the year is on Tuesday the 13th, and that will be deliberations on urban reserves. So you remember you had your hearing, your joint public hearing for that in October. We've been kind of churning through the testimony, and we'll be going to Lane County the week before you all, and then again coming to you for a recommendation to council on the 13th. And then we're going to kick off 2023 with a public hearing, a second public hearing on the Greenway Code amendments, and that's scheduled for January 10th. You did already have an initial public hearing, but there have been a number of changes to the code, enough that we thought it was prudent to hold a second public hearing on that. We haven't quite ironed out the whole schedule, but February you will be having deliberations on Greenway, It's time for the CIP to come back to you all. Clearly, parking is going to come back at some point. And then in March, we're looking at hopefully a growth monitoring update and information on the climate friendly area component of the climate friendly rules. And then just a heads up on a council topic that is Monday night. They are taking action, or they're scheduled to take action on the clear and objective housing code amendments. You all, well, not all of you, but the Planning Commission took action or recommendation on those last year. The council's decision was appealed and remanded back to the city. So the council is taking action on Monday on a pretty narrow remand. And then just finally, in terms of middle housing, I just wanted to let you know we are seeing permits. We are seeing land divisions, and that's pretty exciting. I think we're up to 3 middle housing land divisions have been submitted, so that's outstanding. And also simultaneously, Lauren and team are working on, as you know, there was an appeal filed to the Land Use Board of Appeals. And so we do have the brief from the folks who appealed it and are working through that. Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong. It would, based on the timelines, we should have a decision by spring-ish. Yeah, roughly spring. But in the meantime, you know, our ordinance is in effect, and we are seeing a fair amount of interest. So that's pretty exciting. Oh, and then just finally, for those of you who've been on the Planning Commission for a while, as you know, we do subcommittee assignments every year. Typically, we do those around the same time as elections because we have people who cycle off committees either because they leave the Planning Commission or because they have they want to, you know, change their assignments. We're a little late coming back to you with those just because there have been some changes in our well, not changes, but we've just been trying to figure out how best to resource some of the projects that are coming. Like, do we need multiple groups for climate friendly, or is one Planning Commission resource group enough? Anyway, I am going to send information to you about that next week. And for our 2 new commissioners, we'll give you enough background information on that so you can hopefully make some educated guesses on what you'd be most interested in participating in. So expect that from me next week. And I wish you all a fantastic Thanksgiving. I have a lot of gratitude for you all. Really appreciate your service to the city. I feel just really lucky that we have you all. And I think this, you know, this discussion tonight just solidifies that for me. So thank you. You're so thoughtful and considerate of what you do. So thanks.
Well, great. Do we have any other items from any other commissioners? All right, with that, I will end the meeting at 7:28, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Hope that we can actually meet in person. I know that there are some folks I've yet to meet at all. I've yet to have one meeting live in person. Maybe we can rectify that in the new year.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanksgiving, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.
See you soon.